It was not a metaphor. That is the first thing to understand, and possibly the hardest. When a Jewish man in first-century Galilee looked up at the night sky, he was not gazing at an infinite, silent void scattered with distant suns. He was looking at a structured reality, a layered architecture, a place with floors, gates, inhabitants, temperatures, and sounds. The sky above him was not empty, it was full. We have inherited a cosmology so shaped by modern astronomy that we can barely imagine what it felt like to live inside a different one. We know now that what we call the sky is simply the atmosphere, and beyond it, the cold geometry of space. But to a man in Capernaum in the year 30, the heavens were not space. They were a place you could, in principle, enter. A place where real things happened. A place with addresses. This is not primitive superstition. It is a deeply coherent worldview, one that had been refined across centuries of Jewish thought, shaped by Babylonian influence, by Persian cosmology, by the books of Enoch, by priestly tradition, and by the lived experience of a people who believed that the God who created the universe had not retreated from it. The heavens were not a poetic way of saying very far away. They were the architecture of reality itself. And Jesus lived inside this world. He breathed this air. He prayed these prayers. He taught people who held this cosmology not as a theory, but as the fabric of their daily spiritual life. If you want to understand what it actually meant when those around Jesus spoke of heaven, not the vague modern concept of clouds and harps, but the specific structured inhabited reality they had in mind, then stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels, how we hear the prayers of Paul, and how we grasp what the earliest Christians believed was happening when Jesus ascended. To begin, you have to leave the modern world entirely. You have to walk into a village in first-century Judea or Galilee, a place of packed earth streets, limestone walls still warm from the afternoon sun, the smell of olive oil burning in clay lamps, the sound of goats shifting in the lower room of a house at dusk. In this village, the sky is not background, it is presence. There is no light pollution. On a clear night in the Galilean hills, the stars do not twinkle at a distance, they press in. The Milky Way cuts across the sky like a river of fire. The moon rises orange over the eastern ridge and turns silver by midnight. In a world without electricity, without the constant artificial light that flattens our modern experience of night, darkness was real and the sky above it was overwhelming. In this context, the Jewish understanding of heaven was not abstract. It was almost architectural in its precision. The word used most commonly in the Hebrew scriptures, shamayim, is itself plural. It never appears in the singular, the heavens, always, not one sky but many. This was not grammatical habit, it was cosmological conviction. Plurality was built into the language because plurality was built into the reality. By the time of Jesus, this general sense of layered heavens had developed into a rich and detailed tradition, preserved in texts that were widely read, widely discussed, and deeply influential among Jewish communities from Alexandria to Jerusalem to the Galilean villages where Jesus taught. These were not fringe documents. They were part of the spiritual furniture of the age. The Book of Enoch, which scholars date in its various sections to several centuries before Christ, describes in vivid detail the experience of the patriarch Enoch as he is carried through multiple heavens by angelic guides. He observes each layer with the eyes of a traveler, noting landmarks, the temperature changes, the quality of light, the kinds of beings he encounters, the sounds, the silence. This was not allegory to its readers, it was cosmographic reporting. Enoch had been there. He had seen it. Other texts, the Testament of Levi, the Apocalypse of Abraham, later the Ascension of Isaiah and Sekek Enoch, each contributed to a tradition that was living and evolving and deeply present in the intellectual and spiritual life of first-century Judaism. Not every Jew would have read these texts in their written form. Many would have heard them. In a culture where literacy was limited and oral tradition carried enormous weight, these images of the layered heavens circulated through synagogue teaching, through priestly instruction, through the conversations of traveling scholars who stopped in villages along the roads of Galilee. The common man in Capernaum did not need to have read Enoch to know that the heavens had layers. He knew it the way he knew that the temple had courts, some accessible, some restricted, some approachable only with the right preparation, the right purity, the right identity. The architecture of heaven mirrored in many ways the architecture of the sacred on earth. Both were structured, both had boundaries, both separated the ordinary from the holy in careful, graduated degrees. This is where the cosmology becomes not just interesting, but theologically charged. The heavens were not simply where God lived in some distant, vague way. They were a system, a hierarchy. And understanding that system was, for many devout Jews of the first century, not an academic exercise. It was a map of the universe they inhabited, a guide to the powers at work around them, and a framework for understanding prayer, angels, evil, protection, and the ultimate destiny of the righteous dead. To stand in a first-century Jewish village at night looking up was to be aware, in a way we have almost entirely lost, that what lay above you was real, structured, populated, and consequential, and Jesus stood under that same sky. The first heaven was the closest one. Not close in the way we might imagine, not a ceiling just above the rooftops, but close in the sense that it was the most immediately visible layer of the cosmic architecture, the one that touched the edges of human experience most directly. It was the heaven of clouds, of wind, of weather, of the movements of the moon and the observable stars. In the tradition preserved across multiple Jewish texts, this first layer was neither simple nor empty. It was inhabited and governed. To understand what this meant concretely, you have to think about weather in a world without meteorology. In first-century Galilee, rain was not a convenience or an inconvenience. It was survival. The agricultural calendar, barley in spring, wheat shortly after, grapes and olives through the long, dry summer, depended entirely on the pattern of rains. The early rain, the Yore, fell in October and November and softened the baked earth enough for ploughing and sowing. The late rain, the Malkosh, fell in March and April and swelled the grain before harvest. Between those two rains, the farmer existed in a state of sustained, quiet anxiety. A village in the Jezreel Valley, or on the slopes above the Sea of Galilee, was a community organized around this anxiety. The storage jars in the back room of every house, large, thick-walled ceramic vessels sealed with cloth and pitch, represented months of calculation. How much grain to store, how much to eat, how much to set aside for seed. If the late rain failed, the calculus collapsed. If the early rain came too hard and washed away the newly planted seed, you replanted and prayed the second sowing would hold. These were not abstract worries. They were the texture of daily life. In this context, the governance of weather was not a peripheral theological question. It was the central practical question of existence. And Jewish cosmology placed the governance of weather, the movement of clouds, the release of rain, the paths of wind in the first heaven under the supervision of angelic figures assigned to these elemental forces. This was not mythology in the dismissive sense. It was a framework for understanding why some years brought abundance and others brought starvation. And more importantly, who to address when you prayed for rain. The prayers themselves survive. In the Jewish liturgical tradition, the prayer for rain, Tefillat Geshem, was and remains one of the most solemn of the year, recited on Shemini Atzeret at the end of the Sukkot festival, at precisely the moment when the early rains should begin. The congregation stands. The cantor's voice drops into a particular ancient melody. The prayer calls on the memory of the patriarchs and their relationship with water. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, the 12 tribes crossing the Jordan. It is an invocation of covenant, addressed ultimately to the God who governs the heavens and the forces within them. A man who prayed this prayer, who felt the weight of it in his chest as he stood in the synagogue in late October, was not engaging in abstract religious exercise. He was addressing, through the structure of the cosmos, the being who governed what happened in the first heaven, where the clouds gathered or failed to gather, where the wind turned south and brought warmth or north and brought frost. Above this first heaven, in the texts that shaped first-century Jewish imagination, came the second, a place of greater mystery and greater power. Here the traditions begin to diverge in their details, but their common thread is consistent. The second heaven was a place of transition, a realm where something was held or stored or awaited. In some texts it contained the fallen angels, those beings who had transgressed the boundaries between heaven and earth, described in Genesis 6, now confined and awaiting judgment. In others it was a place of provisional existence for souls between death and their final destination. What matters for understanding the world of Jesus is not resolving the precise theological content of these descriptions. The texts themselves do not agree on every detail, but recognizing the functional reality they expressed. Between earth and the throne of God lay not empty distance, but structured, inhabited space. Things happened in those intermediate layers. Beings moved through them. Forces were concentrated or restrained there. The gap between human prayer rising from a limestone village and the divine ear was not a vacuum. It was a populated corridor. This is the world in which Paul writes in his second letter to the Corinthians that he was caught up to the third heaven. He does not explain what the third heaven is. He does not define it. He does not argue for its existence. He mentions it the way you mention a city, assuming his readers know the geography, caught up to the third heaven, as if his audience would immediately understand that the first two had been passed through, that the third represented something specific and significant, that the experience required no cosmological footnote, because the cosmological framework was already shared. That shared framework is exactly what modern readers lack, and exactly what makes Paul's statement feel opaque to us. It felt anything but opaque to the communities in Corinth, in Ephesus, in Antioch, who received his letters. They knew the map. They had grown up with it. It was the architecture inside, which prayer, vision, angelic encounter, and divine experience were all located. The third heaven, in the dominant tradition, was a place of paradise. The word itself, Pardes in Hebrew, borrowed from the Persian word for a walled garden, described a place of extraordinary beauty and peace associated with the righteous dead, with the presence of something that could only be approached with overwhelming awe. In some texts, it contained the tree of life. In others, it was the place where the souls of the martyrs rested, held in a kind of luminous waiting. To be caught up to the third heaven, then, was not simply to have a transcendent experience of elevation. It was to have passed through two inhabited layers of cosmic reality and arrived at the place where the righteous dead existed in the presence of the divine. It was a specific destination with a specific meaning. Paul had been, in some sense he himself could not fully articulate, whether in the body or out of it, he did not know, to the place where the dead in God live. This specificity matters because it tells us something essential about the world in which the earliest Christian proclamation was made. When the first followers of Jesus announced that he had risen and ascended, They were not speaking vaguely. They were making a claim about movement through a structured universe. He had gone somewhere with an address, somewhere that the people hearing this news already had a name for, already had a location in their mental map of reality. The ascension was not disappearance into abstraction. It was arrival at a destination. The higher you went, the more dangerous it became. This is not a metaphor for spiritual pride, though later Christian mystics would develop it in that direction. In the first century Jewish understanding of the heavens, the upper layers were genuinely cosmologically hazardous. Not because God was hostile, but because the concentrated presence of holiness was, by its very nature, incompatible with the unprepared human. The same logic that governed the temple in Jerusalem, where degrees of sanctity increased as you moved inward, where the wrong person in the wrong court at the wrong moment faced mortal consequences, governed the heavens in graduated, intensifying form. To understand this, you have to feel what the temple actually meant to someone living under its shadow. Not the sanitized Sunday school version of a beautiful building, but the visceral, physical reality of the place. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem covered an area larger than 30 football fields. Its walls rose 45 meters above the surrounding streets. The stones used in its construction were among the largest ever quarried in the ancient world. Some measuring 12 meters in length, weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together without mortar with a precision that still baffles engineers. When the disciples of Jesus, fresh from the villages of Galilee, saw it for the first time, their reaction recorded in the Gospels is not reverence. It is stunned, almost childlike amazement. "Teacher, look, what stones, what buildings." But beyond its physical scale, the temple was a machine of graduated holiness. Its courts were arranged concentrically, each one more restricted than the last. The outer court, the court of the Gentiles, was open to anyone: merchants, pilgrims, Romans, the curious. Beyond it lay the court of women, accessible to Jewish men and women both, but no further for women. Beyond that, the court of Israel, where Jewish men could stand during the offering of sacrifices. Beyond that, the court of the priests, where only the descendants of Aaron could enter. And at the center, the Holy of Holies, a room without windows, without furniture except the ark, entered by one man, the high priest, once a year, on Yom Kippur, after days of ritual purification, and not without blood. The wrong person in the wrong space faced death. This was not a theoretical warning. A stone inscription found by archaeologists, dating to the period of the Second Temple, reads in Greek and Latin, "No foreigner may enter within the balustrade and the enclosure around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will be personally responsible for his subsequent death." The warning was understood. The boundary was real. The heavens replicated this structure on a cosmic scale. The lower heavens were, in a sense, the outer courts, inhabited, active, containing figures and forces that moved and functioned within a range that made them at least intelligible to human experience. But the upper heavens, the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, were increasingly interior chambers, and what dwelt there was increasingly beyond the capacity of human frames to absorb without being transformed or destroyed. The texts that describe these upper heavens are marked by a consistent feature. The visionaries who enter them do not enter casually. They are carried, they are guided, they are transformed along the way, their bodies altered, their faces changed, their capacity for perception upgraded by angelic intervention before they can proceed. Enoch, in the tradition that bears his name, is anointed with oil that makes him luminous before he can stand in the higher courts. He is clothed in garments of glory. His face, the text says, shines like the face of the sun. Only then can he advance. This is not decorative narrative. It is cosmological logic. You cannot bring the unprepared into the presence of concentrated holiness without consequence. The preparation was not ceremonial performance. It was ontological necessity. Something had to change in the person before the person could survive what lay ahead. In the traditions that describe the fourth and fifth heavens, the content shifts dramatically from what was found in the lower layers. Here the concerns are no longer weather and fallen angels and the provisional rest of souls. Here the machinery of time itself is located. In 2nd Enoch, one of the most detailed of these ascent texts, the fourth heaven contains the courses of the sun and moon, not simply as observable phenomena, but as managed realities, administered by angelic figures who regulate their movements with precision. The sun travels in its chariot through this heaven, accompanied by vast numbers of attendant beings. The calculations of sacred time, the calendar by which festivals are determined and Sabbaths are counted, originate here. For a people whose entire religious life was structured around sacred time, whose identity was expressed through the weekly Sabbath, whose communal memory was organized around the annual cycle of festivals, whose covenant relationship with God was marked by observances tied to the movements of sun and moon. This was not abstract cosmology. The regulation of sacred time was a theological matter of the highest order. And the Essene community at Qumran, whose library of scrolls was discovered in caves above the Dead Sea, went to war, in print if not in blood, over which calendar was correct, because they understood that using the wrong calendar meant worshipping on the wrong day, which meant the worship itself was invalid, which meant the entire structure of covenant life was compromised. The heavens where the sun's course was governed were therefore not remote or irrelevant. They were the source of the ordering principle that made Jewish life possible. As the ascent texts move into the sixth and seventh heavens, the language strains visibly. The writers reach for imagery and fall back on light. Overwhelming, categorically different light. Light that is not illumination in the ordinary sense, but something closer to substance, to presence, to the raw material of divinity itself. The angelic beings in these upper chambers are no longer messengers or administrators. They are creatures of pure worship, consumed entirely in the act of standing before the throne, their voices producing the sound that the Hebrew tradition called the Kedusha, Holy, 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 the Lord of Hosts, Ord. The whole earth is full of his glory, the words that Isaiah heard in his vision of the divine throne room, the words that would become the central acclamation of Jewish liturgical prayer, and through it, of Christian worship as well. What Isaiah saw in the temple, in his vision recorded in the 6th chapter of his book, the hem of the divine robe filling the sanctuary, the seraphim with 6 wings covering their faces and their feet and crying to one another, was understood by first-century readers not as a poetic vision of something ineffable, but as a glimpse, mediated through prophetic experience, of what actually existed in the uppermost heaven. Isaiah had seen the 7th heaven, or something of it, enough to come undone entirely, to cry out that he was a man of unclean lips living among a people of unclean lips, because even the partial sight of that reality made everything impure in comparison. This is the context in which the followers of Jesus processed what they believed had happened to him. He had not simply died and returned. He had, they claimed, ascended, passed through, arrived, and not arrived at the first heaven or the third. The claim, as it developed in the earliest Christian writing, was more radical than that, and it is a claim that only makes full sense against the background of this 7-layered universe that every person hearing it already inhabited. There was a phrase that circulated in the mystical traditions of first-century Judaism, preserved in fragments across the texts that scholars would later call the literature of heavenly ascent. It described the highest point of the cosmic architecture, the place beyond the 6th heaven at the threshold of the 7th, as the place where the Merkabah stood. The word means chariot, not a vehicle in the ordinary sense, But the divine throne chariot described by the prophet Ezekiel in the first chapter of his book, one of the most strange, dense, and visually overwhelming passages in the entire Hebrew Bible, 4 living creatures with 4 faces each, wheels within wheels with eyes along their rims, a firmament like crystal stretched above them, and above the firmament a throne, and on the throne a figure with the appearance of a human being, surrounded by something like fire, something like radiance, something like the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel does not say it is God. He says it has the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. The language retreats from direct description through 3 successive layers of qualification: appearance, likeness, glory, because the thing being described cannot be approached directly in language any more than it can be approached directly in person. The chariot, the Merkabah, was the visible, mobile manifestation of divine presence, the throne that moved through the heavens, the center around which the entire 7-layered architecture was organized. By the 1st century, meditation on this passage in Ezekiel had become one of the most serious and restricted practices in Jewish spiritual life. The rabbis would later codify warnings about it. The account of the chariot was not to be expounded before more than one person at a time, not to be taught to anyone who had not already demonstrated wisdom and maturity, not to be approached without preparation. The danger was real, they believed. The story was told of 4 sages who entered Pardes, paradise, the heavenly garden, the upper chambers, and only one, Rabbi Akiva, entered in peace and departed in peace. The others were destroyed, driven mad, or died in the attempt. This was the summit of the cosmic architecture that Jesus' contemporaries inhabited, 7 heavens, each more interior and more holy than the last, culminating in the throne room of the divine, where the Merkabah stood, and the seraphim cried without ceasing, and the accumulated holiness of the universe concentrated itself into something that no ordinary human body could survive unmediated. And then the earliest Christians made their claim, not simply that Jesus had risen from the dead, though that alone was a claim of shattering consequence. Not simply that he had been exalted, honored, vindicated, though those were part of it. The claim, as it appears with striking consistency across the earliest layers of Christian writing, was that Jesus had been seated at the right hand of the throne, placed as a human being, at the apex of the 7-layered universe, at the center of the Merkabah, in the position that the Psalms described as the position of ultimate divine authority. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. To people who held the cosmology we have been tracing, who understood exactly what the 7th heaven was, who knew what dwelt there and what it cost to approach it, who had been shaped by the traditions of Enoch and Ezekiel and Isaiah, this claim was not a vague spiritual promotion. It was a precise, located, cosmologically specific statement. A human being born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, executed outside Jerusalem, had passed through all 7 heavens and been installed at their summit, not dissolved into divinity, not transformed beyond recognition, seated as himself, in the place where the universe was governed. You begin to feel, standing inside this cosmology, why the early Christian movement produced such immediate and intense controversy. This was not a disagreement about ethics or religious practice or the interpretation of Torah, though it became all of those things. At its root, it was a cosmological claim. A claim about what had happened in the structure of the universe, a claim about who now occupied the throne room of the 7th heaven. And the people hearing it, whether they accepted it or rejected it, understood exactly what was being said. This is why the letter to the Ephesians, one of the most cosmologically dense documents in the entire New Testament, speaks of Christ being raised and seated in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but in the one to come. The language of rule, authority, power, and dominion is not political language borrowed casually from the Roman imperial context, though it resonates with that context as well. It is cosmological language. It refers to the populated layers of the heavenly architecture, the beings, the forces, the governing powers that inhabited the intermediate heavens and administered the elements and held the structures of earthly life in their hands. The claim is that Jesus now stands above all of them. Every layer, every court, every angelic administrator of weather and time and the courses of the stars, every being who ever caused a visionary to tremble at a threshold, he is above them. He passed through their domains. He sits where the throne is. This is also why the prologue of the Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," is not, for its original readers, a philosophical abstraction borrowed from Greek thought, though it engages that thought. It is a cosmological statement read against the architecture of the seven heavens. The one who became flesh and dwelt among us was not a creature who had been elevated. He was the one who had always inhabited the summit, who had come down through all seven layers to enter the world at the bottom, a village, a stable, a peasant family in a marginal province of the Roman Empire, and who had then returned, carrying humanity with him, back through all of them to the place from which he had come. The descent and the ascent, the coming down and the going up. Understood against the seven-layered heaven, these are not poetic images. They are a journey with a route, a trajectory through a structured universe, a movement from the throne room downward, through inhabited layer after inhabited layer, into the density of human flesh, and then back again. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he began with two words that would have oriented every person hearing them immediately within this cosmological framework: Our Father, who art in heaven, not in the sky, not in a vague spiritual somewhere, in heaven. The word carried all of this: the layers, the structure, the populated courts, the threshold of the seventh, the throne at the center. The prayer that Christians have recited in every language and on every continent for 2,000 years begins by locating God within an architecture that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. And yet, the prayer itself is not about the architecture. It is about relationship. Our Father, the one who sits at the summit of the seven-layered universe, before whom the seraphim cover their faces, in whose presence the greatest of the ancient visionaries trembled and were transformed, that one is addressed as Father. The cosmological distance is absolute. The relational distance, Jesus is saying, is none. This was the revolution. Not a dismantling of the cosmic architecture, not a dismissal of the heavenly layers and the forces that inhabited them, but a reopening of the route. A new and living way, as the letter to the Hebrews would put it, through the curtain. The curtain that divided the outer courts from the inner, the curtain that separated the accessible from the unapproachable. In the temple, it was a physical object, thick as a man's hand, woven in blue and purple and crimson, embroidered with cherubim. The Gospels record that at the moment of Jesus' death, it tore. From top to bottom, from the inside out. The men and women who stood outside Jerusalem on that afternoon and heard that the curtain had torn would have understood, within this cosmological world, exactly what that image meant. The graduated holiness, the layered separation, the structure that kept the ordinary human at a safe distance from the concentrated presence of the divine. It had been opened, not abolished, opened. The layers were still there. The throne was still there, but the passage through them was no longer barred. This is what the seven heavens understood properly. Illuminate about the world in which Jesus lived and taught and died. He was not speaking into a cosmological vacuum. He was speaking into a universe his listeners already knew was structured, populated, and morally serious. And everything he said about the Father who sees in secret, about the kingdom of heaven advancing, about the one who descended from heaven and would return there, was heard against that background, that architecture, that map of the real. The sky above a Galilean village at night was not empty. It never had been. And the one who looked up at it from Nazareth knew exactly what was there.